Good evening. If there's one day of the year when Americans hate their government, it's today, when the cost of that government becomes vivid for every taxpayer. Today, while millions rush to the mailbox to get their tax returns postmarked by the midnight deadline, Congress began sweating through a 2-month effort to cut income taxes. Hanging over their heads will be the awesome reality of a federal deficit of some $60 billion. All of this agony for taxpayer and Congress alike might be lessened if everyone paid their taxes honestly. Tonight we look at those who don't, the underground economy, people from waitresses to professional men who don't report income to the government. Those earnings may run as high as $200 billion a year, and the taxes from that amount could wipe out or greatly reduce the federal deficit. It's an old story in other countries. In France, they call it travail au noir, moonlighting. In Italy, the black labor market, which made up 10% of employment last year. In Britain, it's called the fiddle. The question is, are our very high tax rates causing more Americans to beat the system? Jim?
Robin, there's a section on page 8 of this year's tax form entitled, What Income to Report? And the last line on the page says, big as life, embezzled and other illegal income. That's right, the law says all the embezzlers and other crooks out there are supposed to tell Uncle Sam how much money they made on gambling, prostitution, armed robbery, burglary, and so on. Do they do it? Well, no way. They're the most obvious multi-million-dollar part of this thing called the underground economy. But crime, organized and otherwise, is actually only a small portion of the total subterranean pie. The rest is generated by a closed-mouth society of seemingly normal, honest people, from high-roller professionals to welfare mothers. A few thumbnail sketches for the record. There's Dr. P. He's a house physician for a large New York City hotel. For taking care of hotel guests, Dr. P receives free office space and a $40,000 a year salary, which the doctor dutifully reports to the IRS. But Dr. P also sees outside patients at a fee of $20 per office visit, paid in cash. His cash-only policy eliminates paperwork and the need to report an additional $30,000 a year in income.
Everyone knows somebody like Dr. P who works off the books. Today, more and more Americans seem to be joining the underground economy. There's Maureen, the waitress. She's divorced with a young son and a husband who skipped town. As the mother of an abandoned child, the state of New Jersey pays Maureen $235 a month in welfare benefits. But that doesn't meet expenses. And state law says that Maureen can make only so much money or she'll lose those benefits. So the $7,800 a year that Maureen earns from wages and tips at a diner go unreported. Photographer John B. owns a very profitable studio. He reports every penny of his $75,000 photography business. But John also rents his studio to 2 freelance photographers. They pay a total of $5,000 a year in cash. That income has never appeared on a tax form.
Another common story is that of Sam, the senior citizen on Social Security. Sam owned and operated a laundromat for more than 30 years. Now the store is run by his son, Milt. Although on Social Security, Sam isn't totally retired. Except for winters when he's in Florida, Sam works part-time at the laundromat and takes out of the business $8,000 a year, all off the books. Small businessmen like Sam and Milt are among the largest contributors to the underground economy. By keeping their own books, they are in a position to tell the IRS only what they want to. The biggest underreporters of all, though, are farmers. The IRS estimates that farmers fail to report about 30% of the income they should be reporting. Other experts estimate the figure at closer to 1/2. A Treasury Department official says farmers aren't taxed anywhere near the level of others, thanks to a system sanctioned by Congress and extending to IRS auditors and agents. One way farmers come out ahead at tax time is through barter, taking payment in kind, fertilizer for farm equipment, seed for livestock. These kinds of transactions rarely get reported. The Agriculture Department estimates that the amount of farm income not reported last year worked out to about $9.5 billion.
Rural America isn't the only place where bartering is going on today. As our drawing shows, accountants are swapping services with dentists. And anyone who has any service or product to trade can do it. Barter is perfectly legal as long as the transaction is reported to the IRS, which taxes items at their fair market value. It's that liability that is encouraging barter. Our own industry, television, is one of the biggest barterers of all, swapping advertising time for travel, meals, cars, or anything any advertiser has to offer. It's legal if it's declared. Another form of income that is vastly underreported is from dividends and bank interest. According to the Commerce Department, Americans received $16 billion more in interest and $3 billion more in dividends than they reported to the IRS in 1974, the last year studied. The Treasury wants Congress to require payers of dividends and interest to withhold taxes. Corporations and banks actively oppose the idea. Well, how big is the underground economy? How much income goes unreported each year? One man who's been studying this is Peter Gutmann, an economics professor at Baruch College of the City University of New York. He's come up with a startling figure of $195 billion, or roughly 10% of the entire gross national product. Dr. Gutmann, in simple terms, how do you figure so large an amount?
At the present time, there is a truly extraordinary amount of currency in circulation outside the banks. There is more than $400 per capita for every man, woman, and child in the United States in $5 bills, $10 bills, $100 bills, and so on. Why do we need this fantastic amount of currency? I sought an answer to this, and I concluded that it was necessary to lubricate the subterranean economy. If you look at long historical time periods, what you find is that people tend to use less currency and more checking accounts, demand deposits. In other words, they put more money in the bank and less in their pockets. This was true in the United States from the 1890s to the eve of the Second World War. There was a substantial decline in that 50-year period of the ratio of currency to demand deposits. But starting with the Second World War, you had a lot of increase in taxation, you had regulations, and of course the black market. There was an explosion of the use of currency. So in 4 short years, the economy made up in the ratio of cash to demand deposit what it had lost in the preceding 50 years. Then after the war dribbled off. But for the last 17 years, ever since 1961, there has been a steady rise and rise and rise in the ratio of cash to demand deposits. And this rise is essentially due to the use of the cash in subterranean activities. What I did is I looked at the ratio in the pre-World War II period before you had all the big taxes and all the regulations. I then looked at the ratio now, and I made a calculation to determine how much of the existing cash was useful or necessary for ordinary and customary business transactions. I found that more than 1/3 of the cash which we have in existence is used for other purposes, namely subterranean purposes, and I then calculated this out to be $195 billion as of 1977, and obviously it's running at a rate over $200 billion now.
As you know, some economists believe that your figures are much too high. What is your answer for them?
Very few economists have given this matter any thought. Reporters call them up and they respond on the telephone off the top of their hats. However, Seymour Zucker, the economics editor of Business Week, tried to track down the subterranean income, and he came up with approximately $100 billion, not including either the classical illegal activities, such as drug running, or theft from businesses. By the time you add those two on, you get about $150 billion. There's also a fellow at Harvard University by the name of John Henry who is interested in large bills, namely 50s and 100s, and how they're used for tax evasion. He made a calculation on the large bills only of somewhat more than $80 billion. Of course, then you have to add on the amount of evasion with small bills, and by that time, again, the estimate is going to be well over $100 billion.
How many people do you think could be involved in this?
There are full-time people and part-time people. There are approximately 2 million people engaged in this activity, I have estimated, on a full-time basis, and then there are many, many, many millions on a part-time basis, people who have ordinary and regular jobs and then have subterranean income on top of those jobs.
But surely, if all those people are employed in this subterranean way, that would make the official unemployment figures rather accurate, because more people would be working than the government says are working.
Well, the labor force is bigger than the government says, and more people are employed than the government says. The unemployment rate would be somewhat less than the government figures indicate.
Why is it growing as rapidly as this? Have Americans become cynical or amoral about their taxes?
I think there are a number of different reasons. First, we had an unpopular war, the Vietnamese War. People didn't want to pay any taxes for this war. Selective obedience to the law became the order of the day, and that generation has grown and continues. Once you start not paying taxes, it's easy to persuade yourself you should not pay any taxes. Nixon didn't help matters, obviously. Secondly,
you mean because of his own personal tax?
Yes, right.
Avoidance.
Secondly, there's been a tremendous increase in the sheer size of the government. Government expenditures in this country now take about 1/3 of the gross national product. Thirdly, there is an essential failure of the federal government to deliver any services to the taxpayer. A dollar tax is a dollar loss is a common attitude. Now, the reason for this, there are really two reasons for it. A lot of the expenditures of the federal government now go for income redistribution. A recent report by the Congressional Budget Office estimated the total for the country at approximately $300 billion. And also, the nature of the federal expenditures are such that the common citizen does not feel that these expenditures do him personally any good, and thus he tends to ignore it. But the basic point here is the failure to deliver services for the taxes. On top of this, of course, you have inflation. One way of getting around inflation is to get income which is not taxed. Then the tax system is considered one of tremendous complexity and also unfairness. And of course, there are innumerable taxes and regulations which make it very difficult for the ordinary citizen to understand what's going on.
Thank you. Jim?
All right, a man who once had the job of doing something about the underground economy is Mortimer Kaplan. Mr. Kaplan was Commissioner of Internal Revenue during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He's now an attorney here in Washington and teaches tax law at the University of Virginia. First, Mr. Kaplan, do you agree with Dr. Gutman's analysis of how widespread, how serious this practice is?
Well, I think they're pretty dramatic figures. I have a great deal of difficulty in accepting them. He's talking about $195 billion of income. That's not taxes. I think he reduces that to about $48 billion in taxes. And I would say that's at least 4 times as large as the Internal Revenue Service has ever estimated. I think they would probably come up with maybe income of $50 billion, about a quarter of what Dr. Gutman says, and maybe $10 billion of taxes, and compare that with $368, I think, billion collected this past year. The truth of the matter is that the American taxpayer is a remarkably good taxpayer. Now, there are plenty of defects, and he certainly has outlined many of them, but we shouldn't lose sight that in the main, the average taxpayer pays right down the middle, and many pay more than they ought to be paying. Now, I think we need some perspective in this.
Okay, but $50 billion is still an awful lot of money.
$10 billion in taxes.
$10 billion in taxes. All right, and it is growing from year to year. What do you think is the reason for that growth?
Well, I think part of it is, has been stated, sort of a lack of confidence in government, disapproval of many of the policies in government. I think one of the important things is that the Revenue Service is not auditing anywhere near the number of returns they ought to be examining.
All right, well, let's pursue that. They used to, what do they audit now? What, 2.8%?
Well, less than that. I would say closer to 2% in terms of individual tax returns. And we had it up as, I say we, the years I was in government, it was up as high as 5.8%.
And you think there's a direct relationship between the number of tax returns that are audited and people's honesty in filing their
Very
return?
definitely. It's almost like that parked white automobile on the highway that tends to slow people down. I think there's a need to examine more returns, and I think it's fair to the average taxpayer that this be done. My feeling is that the American taxpayer will pay his taxes if he feels a man down the street is doing the same. He doesn't like to be a sucker. He doesn't like to feel that someone is beating the game and that he's picking up the tab. So I really think that our compliance is very good in this country, and I also think that there's need to strengthen that by a broadened audit of as many taxpayers as we could do. Now, I would say the 5% range is where we ought to be.
That means more IRS auditors, more IRS agents, just an expanded Internal Revenue Service.
Well, I think that's part of it. I think the Internal Revenue Service has some problems, too, and they're making an effort. They're trying to streamline some of their functions. They just recently announced an elimination of a double level of review. They're trying to put more of their people on the line, examining returns. pull them away from administrative jobs. That's one of the things. There should be additional revenue agents, too. I think the Congress has been a little loath to expand that force. I think they should expand the revenue agents. There are only about 20,000 revenue agents and tax auditors, probably closer to 19,000. They ought to have a 50% increase. It probably would cost $300 million for that, and they would collect at least, in direct enforcement, $1.5 billion. The ratio of 5 to 1 has been traditional over the years. In addition, that would improve compliance, and it's hard to measure what that would do.
All right, thank you. All right, there are a lot of people who are very upset over the extent of the so-called underground economy, and none more so than Dr. Thomas Reese, director of a tax reform lobby group called Taxation with Representation. Mr. Reese, where do you come down, with Mr. Kaplan or Dr. Gutman? First, on the extent of the problem.
I think the extent of the problem is hard to measure. I think we have to get the government and the Treasury Department to look at this thing much more carefully. But the thing to remember is that if it is as extensive as Dr. Gutman says, then what we're talking about is approximately $650 per taxpayer that the average taxpayer has to pick up in order to make up for all the money that is lost through this underground economy. In other words, your tax bill and every other person's tax bill is $650 higher this year because Congress has not given the IRS the money to fund an adequate audit program.
Well, do you agree that with Mr. Kaplan that the heart of the problem is that IRS just isn't auditing enough tax returns?
I think that's part of the problem. I think there's another very important aspect, though, that has to be looked at, and that is the fact that our tax system right now is a disgrace. Carter said that, but it's also a very evident thing to millions of taxpayers. Now, when a taxpayer sits down and fills out his tax return, he finds out, the average taxpayer, he finds out, I don't have these loopholes that everybody else has. I don't have the 3-martini lunch. I can't go to a theater with a tax-deductible ticket. Now, the reaction to that is a real concern that he's being penalized and has to pay higher taxes while the people with the loopholes don't. Now, it seems to me that if we want to deal with this problem, we have to deal with it by getting rid of the loopholes in the tax code so that we can restore the kind of confidence in our tax system that is necessary so that the average taxpayer will be willing to pay his fair share, but only his fair share of taxes.
If something is not done soon, do you think that there could be serious consequences to the tax system and the whole way we collect taxes in this country? Is it getting out of hand?
I think if the amount of money gets worse and if Congress does not do its job and pass the President's tax reform package, then I think the situation is going to get worse. The problem is that the American people have to get concerned about the abuses and the problems that there are, and they have to tell their congressmen that they want these loopholes closed. They want everybody to be treated fairly.
But is it also unrealistic, strictly in human terms, for the average taxpayer to also tell his congressman, hey, hire more IRS agents so I can increase the chance of my own tax return being audited? Doesn't that kind of go against human nature, Mr. Reese?
I think that the vast majority of the American people are very honest when they're filling out their tax returns. And what they want is to make sure that everyone else is honest. I mean, I represent taxpayers. We are a taxpayers lobby, Taxation with Representation. And I'm going to Congress and saying, we want you to fund more auditing because our members are filling out their tax returns fairly and honestly, and we want their taxes to go down by making sure that everyone else pays their fair share.
All right, thank you. Robin?
Dr. Gutman, how do you respond to Mr. Kaplan, who thinks your figures may be 4 times too large?
The Internal Revenue Service has its own system of estimation. It's less than the Commerce Department, by the way. I don't know why it is so low. I would agree with Dr. Reese that we simply are going to have to ask the government to take a much closer look at this. I do want to comment on the subject of audits and the subject of loopholes, however. Of course, you can get more taxes if you increase auditing. The problem is, as Congress knows very well, that there are problems if you have a democratic society in terms of increasing the number of auditors on and on. The theory that we need more auditors only is simply one that we need more policemen, and I don't think that is really realistic. It goes away from the real understanding of what the problem is. Now, one point which I do want to make is that essentially what is happening, again, Congress is very well aware of it, that you are getting a partial tax exemption of that section of small business which deals in cash. And this is quite important, and it should be considered as a matter of public policy. Loopholes are often discussed, but one man's loopholes is another man's public policy. If you look at these so-called loopholes, you have things like interest on mortgage payments, you have charitable contributions, you have pensions, you have medical payments, and of course you have the capital gains tax. But we have to remember that in time of inflation, everything goes up, including property values, and so when you sell something, you have an illusory gain in many instances, which is then taxed.
Could I interrupt you? We want to discuss in a moment what to do about this situation. I'd just like to get Mr. Kaplan's reaction. Would you concede, Mr. Kaplan, as a former IRS commissioner, that it's possible that the IRS just doesn't know and that the truth may be nearer Mr. Gutman's estimation and calculation? Is that conceivable to you?
Well, almost anything is conceivable. The truth of the matter is that they've been studying this problem since the beginning of the income tax. And they've got some rather sophisticated economists and statisticians and a great sampling of information in those 85 million individual income tax returns that are filed each year. They are working at it right now. They are making a special effort. I think they're challenged by Dr. Gutman's figures.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Kaplan. How would you explain this extraordinary amount of cash in currency that seems to be in circulation in a very different proportion to what it used to be before the war, before taxes went so high, which is very crudely Mr. Gutman's thesis?
Well, I won't attempt to try to correlate the time deposits and the cash. Dr. Gutman is using sort of a residual catch-all to explain the differential. There are many reasons, I'm sure, that could explain for it in part. People hoard money, and it then becomes uncovered. People put money abroad, and this comes into the flow. But I really think that the main thing is what to do about it.
Well, let's move on to that then,
And I would
Jim.
say one of the things that is long overdue is withholding on dividends and interest. It's one of the largest revenue losers. I think the corporations go along with it. They only have to pay 4 checks a year in the aggregate, which they would file with the Internal Revenue Service if it's a quarterly dividend. I think banks and savings and loans are the ones who have opposed it. It's not a new idea. Back in the Civil War, we actually had withholding on dividends and interest before they had withholding on salaries. And I think this is a primary target. I'd like to say a word about President Carter's tax bill. I think it's a good bill, and I agree with Dr. Reese that it ought to be adopted in the main. We all have little nits here and there that we would pick at. But I don't think it's legislation alone. We've had too much legislation. We've had complexity year after year after year. And I think it's time to give the taxpayer a little peace, so when he makes out this year's tax return, he could look at last year's and have a guide and not have to refigure it all out. The important thing in my book is sound administration. Not only just to go out and police, but to be helpful to taxpayers, taxpayer assistance, to help them make out returns. I think the Internal Revenue Service has to devote a large portion of its resources to help the taxpayer do a better job.
All right, let's pick up on some of those solutions. The dividends and interest withholding. I assume that you would support that, right, Mr. Reese?
Absolutely. I mean, if Dr. Gutman's figures are correct, $195 billion worth of underground economy, if we look at the dividends and interest part of that, it's approximately 10%. So that one reform would take care of 10% of this underground economy and allow the Internal Revenue Service to devote its resources on the other parts of the underground economy. I think that's an absolutely necessary reform.
Dr. Gutman, I assume you would agree with that analysis, right?
Yes, but I'd like to say that this only takes care of a very small part
I
of the
realize
problem.
that. Right.
I'd like to get a crack at this question of what to do. First of all,
Well,
the
that's
government...
exactly what I wanted to do, and I wanted to take it one thing at a time, if I could. I wanted to go to the next point that Mr. Kaplan raised, which was the question of administration at the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. Reese, you're involved in overseeing, from a lobby standpoint, from an interest standpoint, of the administration at IRS. How big a problem is that, and what kind of solution could come out of just the way IRS operates?
Well, I think that if the IRS was given more funds to audit more returns, I think we'd have a much better situation.
But what about the question of gamesmanship, that over here is the tax collector, over here is the taxpayer, and the game becomes the tax collector is trying to get the tax revenue, and the taxpayer over here is trying to avoid it, and that's the reason they hire expensive lawyers and accountants and people like that to keep from paying taxes. Is that ever going to be eliminated?
I don't think it's going to be totally eliminated, but I think that if the taxpayer realizes that he's going to be caught if he commits fraud or if he does not report his entire income, then I think we will go a long ways towards solving this problem.
All right, back to you now, Dr. Gutman. What do you think in terms of the IRS question specifically, what they could do to eliminate the underground economy?
The IRS cannot eliminate the underground economy, except insofar as they have good administration, and they do have good administration, generally speaking. They have the reputation of being the best bureaucracy in Washington. But I don't think this discussion is getting to the fundamentals of what to do about the subterranean economy. And I'd like to get a crack at this briefly. First, you're going to have to look at the provision of services of federal government, because without that, the taxpayer is going to be reluctant to pay any taxes. Secondly, you're going to have to look at the amount of income redistribution which you can undertake through the federal tax and expenditure system.
I hate to interrupt you, but I've got to. Our time for this evening is up. I'm very sorry. We got the drift of what you were beginning to say there. Thank you very much, Mr. Kaplan, Dr. Reese. Good night, Jim. And thank you, Dr. Gutman. That's all for tonight. Jim Lehrer and I'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.